Oh, there we got something. As you may have noticed, you are at Pydata Copenhagen. So for those of you who are new, Pydata Copenhagen is part of the NumFocus organization. So the Pydata umbrella is under the NumFocus organization. So that means that we are also part of the Pydata Code of Conduct. So I'm going to give you the short version here. There's also a bit longer version in case you want to read up on it. But in general, we are kind to each other. We don't use insulting or language that can be used to put down others. We are professionals and we expect you to behave professionally. Harassment, sexist, racist, or exclusionary jokes and language will not be tolerated at a Pydata event. If you are in a situation where you feel uncomfortable, then please do come find myself, and then we will deal with the situation appropriately. You also can write to me afterwards if you feel more comfortable doing so. We haven't had to exercise this yet, so please don't make today the first day. Practicals. So we have the bathroom situation, very important. Out there, wasn't there? You can go out there.
Exit that door, left, right, right, and you're in the bathroom.
There are signs. And I've also asked to make sure that you don't touch anything. There are apparently lots of screens and stuff out there. There's some work in progress being done.
We have a TV studio in that direction, so don't wander down the halls.
Again, we're professionals and we expect you to behave professionally.
Case of emergency, up there. Where you came in, up, out, and you can escape the building safely. There's no alarms.
So practicalities. Number 2, we have our Pac-Man rule. So we are at Pydata Copenhagen, not just to listen to the fantastic talk we're about to enjoy, but also to meet and talk to other people who enjoy the same nerdy stuff that we do. So the way that we do that is that when you're standing in a group, make sure to leave room for someone else to join. That way they can participate in your conversation, because if we're all huddled up like this, it can be very hard to join the conversation. So when someone new does join, remember to open up again so that someone else can join. Corollary to this rule, you try to speak in English. I know it's hard, but it makes it much easier for someone to join your conversation if everyone is able to understand what's going on. Pac-Man rule. Community announcements are, we have our section where the community can share if they have any job openings, some other conferences, some cool stuff going on in Copenhagen/Denmark. And I know we have one.
Job openings. I'm from Management Solutions, located in Sydhavn. We design these techniques for and we have a challenge of making them CO2 stuff. So there's a lot of things going on in our company, and we are expanding. I'm part of the group with our so we're spinning up a system team. So we are hiring a new editor, a full stack developer, person for microservices, and more for this community. Python developer, and also data type. So we have some job openings. I don't think that data science is public yet, but I have a link for it. Okay. Come join us. This works. If you don't believe me, then ask my colleague down here.
Very cool. Anyone else have something?
Anders, can I plug? I mean, maybe it's better after the talk, but we are also recruiting.
I gave you your whole own slide, so you can plug everything you want.
We are also constantly recruiting, right? And in particular, if you have a really good friend that loves architecture and loves to be sort of a practicing architecture guy, not so much blueprint, but more how do we do orchestrate and create a data universe for sort of this, please call me. I'd like some good guys and girls to join my team. And I think Jorge and others can vouch that we're not having, it's not boring.
Very cool. Anyone else? Going once, going twice. That'll work much better if it actually, there we go. See, you had your own slide.
Yeah.
So of course, we have to say thank you very, very much to Novo Nordisk for hosting us and providing all the food and drinks. So let's give them a big hand. We can't run these events without our partners who can pay for these things that I can't pay for. So again, thank you very, very much for that. But they'll have plenty of time to talk about how awesome place Novo Nordisk is in a little bit. So finally, we need you. So again, we can only do this with both our venues, but also our speakers who spend time preparing talks to talk about the things that they're passionate about. So if you do have something that you're passionate about, share it with others. I'm happy to help you workshop your ideas or try to give some feedback on your presentation. It's fun. And it's a nice, calm environment to practice for maybe a bigger conference if you want to go down that route. So yeah, find me on the various channels or later if you have an idea for a talk. And then finally, the main attraction. We do have a slight interlude because we have a lightning talk today. We don't often do this, but when we have volunteers, we can't say no.
Can I just replug?
Moritz, just pull it out. And
this is going to be slightly awkward because I'm going to sit over there at my laptop, but it's only a couple of minutes, so I hope it's not too bad.
And while Moritz sits down, he's actually part of the crew, and he sprung this on us. So we don't know what's coming. It's going to be super interesting.
Yeah, I'll tell you all the ways that Novo Nordisk is bad, of course. So just to announce what I'm going to show you at all, this is basically just about making PyTest fast enough so that you could practice test-driven development if you choose to do so. So just a few handy tools, demonstration to show you how you can do that. Starting, great. Okay, so you can see my terminal. Is that font size okay? Should it be bigger? A little bit bigger. Okay, the cursor is bigger, but everything else disappeared, so that's great. Yeah, I guess I need a new terminal. Right, I'm not going to try again. Sorry. Maybe take out your binoculars or something. So anyway, this is a open source project of mine that I work on, and it has a fairly extensive, maybe overkill test suite. So if I run this, it's gonna take a while. We write out. Well, it has a command line interface. We test that extensively on all the different options. A lot of combinations. And if you want to do test-driven development, of course, you want a super quick feedback loop between a change that you make and then your test suite running and telling you pass or no pass. And as you can see, it's taking its time. It's going to take about, I think, 2-3 minutes. So, of course, I started looking into different tools of how can I speed this up. And one of the things that you might think of first is we live in a multi-core world since a couple of years now. So the first thing you might think of is, of course, can I run these in parallel, right? So if you want to run things in parallel, you can install a tool called can type PyTest xdist if you use PyTest in general, which I highly recommend that you do. And once you have that, you can run your test suite with an argument to say how many cores you want to run on. And this box I'm on only has 2, so not the maximum that you could achieve, but of course, you probably have a powerful developer laptop with many, many cores on it, so you can get much more mileage out of it. This actually, surprisingly, on this test suite scales really well, so it's exactly half the time of what it would take otherwise. But as you can see, still quite an amount of time. So let's stop there too. And the next thing you might think of is when I do development, do I really need to run my whole test suite every time? And if you think you don't, then you can find a tool that's called testmon. So you can install that. And this tool actually works a little bit like coverage. So it records basically which lines of code get called by your test suite. And that means the first run of this tool is going to be just as slow because it needs to run the whole test suite and check your coverage. But once it has done so, it actually allows you then to only run those tests that basically were affected by a code change that you made. And luckily, you can even combine it with distributed testing. And in preparation to this presentation, I already ran this once. So the file exists in the background, and you can see no tests actually had to be run. Now, if you want to do test-driven development, you want to continuously test. And a nice tool for that is called PyTest Watcher. And once you have that installed, you can basically just start the watcher. It watches the directory path that you handed. Here, I just gave it the local directory. And then you can pass any other options that you would like. That will just be straight handed down to PyTest once you run it. And so I can fire it up, and now it will watch my directory. So that means as soon as I make a change, it will run the test suite. Because I gave it the argument of testmon, it will only run those lines of code or those tests that would be affected by the change. So I can, for example, just do a touch on one of the files. And then it has detected that a change happened, but since I didn't make any changes actually to the file, no tests are run. And yeah, I could go in and modify some lines of code and you would see it execute, but I think I'll skip that because it's a lightning talk. Thank you.
Why we love working with Moritz, not just working harder, but working smarter. And you are shifting back to the other screen. Perfect. So, Anders, can we take it from here? Can we take it from here? Cool.
One more thing. I will be taking pictures. If you do not want to be in the pictures, come find me. I'll make sure that you can count.
Also find me because I took some pictures up there. So please, I'll make sure that the AI remove you. And thanks for coming out here to suburbia. This is where we live part of our life. We also have lives at home, quite a few of us, with kids and dogs and stuff, nightly learning, and have a lot of fun. So this is the title we chose, and we thought that that could lure in some people. Happy developers, that's all what we strive for. And then counterbalancing that towards a regulated, if not highly regulated environment. You just got a little sort of insight into both coding and working smarter, not harder. And now I'll hit you with a shitload of corporate slides to explain about Novo Nordisk. I'll do that with a little bit of humor, and I'll do that in the not standard corporate language. So as this goes to YouTube, there might be elements that are filtered out. We are trying to record, and I've, over the last couple of times, been trying to stream this as a live event, but being here on stage and controlling the streaming, I can't do that. So we are recording a Teams meeting, and then it will probably be sent out a little later. Welcome, and thanks for taking a Thursday evening out of your life to share with us. And hopefully you get something out of it that you can use for something. This is me, Henrik Lynge, trying to be a little Santa Clausy with the beard, the stomach, the middle-aged cis male. And I'll be doing a little bit of the talking. I've been around in Novo for 18 years now, been part of a super interesting journey that we'll try to explain a little bit about, coming from something that's massively dominated by big corporate conglomerates like Oracle, where innovation is lost. And it's not that Oracle don't innovate, it never makes it to the customer. And then I'm here with Jorge. Jorge is the founder of Munin Data. And Jorge and I work together on the reg, doing stuff. And part of this is part of the stuff. And I will take you with a little bit of corporate slides into the rabbit hole. So join me and please sort of lean in. Questions are welcome as we go along. I'm not easily sort of thrown off track, and we'll try to keep it a little fresh and try to stay on time. It might be difficult, but we'll try. So just a little facts about the company where you're in now. We are now approaching 60,000 employees. We are all over the world. We are serving millions of patients. We are now top 2 pharma in the world. From market cap, we are bigger than Coca-Cola, which is crazy. And the reason that it's crazy is that from a mindset perspective, it's still a relatively small company. So processes haven't really kept up. We need a lot more automation, streamlining, harmonization, so forth, right? So it's a mom and pop shop that has grown to be a little bit more than mom and pop. I'm super happy to have been part of that journey. And I'm still happy that we have the leadership is actually super authentic and low key and from Herning. And no frills. And so just the other day, by accident, I actually included him in a mail by accident, right? And then 10 minutes later, there's a reply and thanks, Henrik. And I'm just, I like that. It's a trust-based culture, and they're very low key. And I can guarantee that he will never fly a private jet. So it's just, and I love that. So we just came out with the result of a good clinical trial, 5 years, 16,000 patients, amazing results, right? And the focus on the quarterly meeting is think about the opportunity that this will bring to patients. It's, of course, the CFO is a little bit way, right? But sort of generally this is about doing good for a lot of people out there. There'll be a little bit about that. So we are a global company, 80 affiliates around the world. So that's sales reps all over, where they are sort of also part of the organization, but a different part of the organization. I'll try to explain a little bit about that. We've been around for 100 years. This is our 100-year anniversary. Kudos, and this is August Krogh. He got the Nobel Prize. He was clever, and great that he, together with his wife, actually went to Toronto, Canada, and bought the recipe for insulin at $1 Canadian, and brought that home and got the permission to produce, and that turned into where we are today. We have, over the years, had one merger. So only one, and now we're buying a few small companies, right? But we've had one transformative event in the story of the company, and that was in '89. That didn't really disrupt the IT landscape. So since then, it's been organic growth. A little bit of merger acquisition. We're not really good at that. We're practicing. But so that means that it has been sort of, and that's part of the mom and pop shop. We never really got to a stage where we sort of could bring in new blood, and why don't we do it this way? And so a lot of invented here is good, and growing from that. And then a sort of business scenario where numbers have been staggering. So why change? Then around us, there's ecosystems being created where the digital component is potentially more potent than the drug. And part of that is a synthetic pancreas, basically, where you have a pump that's combined with a continuous glucose monitor, and those two talk together so that you get microdosing ongoingly. And that's amazing. It's not a product, it's private hackers that are making that, but it actually works. And part of that is what we are not up against, but trying to work with in a good way. So how can we sort of work in this ecosystem in a good way and bring that innovation to patients and make sure that we actually play well with everybody else? Part of that is also, that's why I'm wearing this shirt. So one of the things that we're investing in is an open source project to make sure that the capture of metadata for clinical trials is something that you can do. And we're giving that away as open source because other startups, biotech, so forth, if they could start the right way down the line, they would have less problems. So we want to lower the barrier to basically be, you need a license for Neo4j, but aside from that, go grab it, run it. You don't have to sort of burn a lot of money because it's one of those things that's actually difficult to argue. Why should we pay for early control? Well, all we want to do is grow. And we're just like, but if you could grow in a controlled way, that would be much better. Also down the line, should we want to buy you? That was a joke. The challenge in the world is actually real. So, and this is still really scary to me. Diabetes have been around for a while. Everybody sort of recognizes as a significant challenge and a disease where if untreated, it won't end well. And fact is that 50% of the people that have the disease, only 50% get the diagnosis. Out of the 50% that get the diagnosis, only 50% of those get any form of treatment. Only 50% of those get treatment that actually makes sure that they don't get long-lasting side effects. And that is amputation and losing eyesight. It's not trivial, right? And so this is basically what we want to change. And part of that is, of course, selling more drugs, but part of it is also giving it away to make sure that we can actually do something good in the world. This is fact of matter, and it's scary. Just so you know. And this is a known disease. It's not, yeah. That's part of why we go to work. Then zooming in a little bit on what do we do with IT here. We're around 3,000 IT dedicated colleagues. We have 57,000 internal users. And then we have approximately 70,000 external users that are participating in our clinical trials. that we make sure that the systems run every day and that they get access and that it's under control and they have signed the affidavits they need to sign and so forth. So actually a big franchise and a big IT operation. And this is sort of, it's split in the company. It's split between this, which is, and it's, I tried to illustrate it with this blue ball machine. It's incredibly complicated. And it's sort of a shitload of point-to-point integrations and old hacks and SAP and whatever we could buy and connect. And there's a little bit of coherency up here between development and research and production. And then there's this underpinning finance and legal and P&O and hire fire and all that admin shebang. And then out here, there's the sales organization, and then rare disease a little bit to the side. They're special. But just this is how it's structured. Then getting a little bit closer to where we sit, development, approximately 3,000 people worldwide. We are proud of the gender split. So we are actually 62% females. And we have more female bosses than male bosses. And we're really proud of that. We like that. It's been a while since I had a male boss, actually. So we like that, 75 different nationalities. We are spending 13% of the net sales. And that's a lot of money. And part of the problem with our industry, or no, it's not a problem, but it's just the market perception is that if you drop below 13%, you're not spending enough investing in your future. So when our sales go like this, we have to find ways of transforming that into expense on R&D. We do that well. So, and it's not that we are swimming in money, but we do have an opportunity over the next 7 years to invest heavily in working smarter. And so compared to a number of other industries, we don't have the constant squeeze to make sure that we can save a nickel here and there, but actually can focus on working smarter. That's a privilege. And we are in here in development doing basically covering phase 1 to submission. I can explain a little bit about, yeah, this is just where we focus. And then I thought it would be a cheap trick to also include a puppy. That would make me seem human. It's my puppy. So that's why he's 9 weeks now. He's quite cute. There's another puppy picture sprinkled in there. We are focused about diabetes care, obesity care, rare disease, and other chronic diseases. I actually, sometimes we start a whole country just for one child in rare disease, which is, it's never going to pay, right? But it's a good thing to do. It's about connecting basically within our therapy areas, connecting the core technology that we are good at. And a lot of that is IT supported, enabled, but it's not core IT. The core that we are good at is basically gene manipulation, controlling yeast, and controlling E. coli in a tank. So sort of tight production of big biologics. And so that means that you have sensitized a particular gene, you ingest that in yeast, and then you put that to a 15,000 liter tank, and then you go for a while and make sure that conditions are ideal, and then you take it out, you purify it, and so forth, right? That's what we are actually really good at. And that has led to also being able to do stuff in RNA, in stem cell, so we have some core technologies that we are expanding and building upon. And then from a sort of business focus perspective, it's very much about obesity, diabetes, and now cardiac health as well. And part of that was because of the result we came out with. So a 20% reduction in cardiac risk is significant. And so that's something that actually brings value to the world. And I'm sorry for it's very corporate, but it's the interesting bit that gets closer to you is actually that there's a lot of focus on historically, it's all been about the drug and a little bit the device. And that is now shifting to have a lot more attention around also the data. And how do we make that work for us and with us? Including also the digital and the diagnostics. And diagnostics is, of course, because part of the models that we need to create will be part of the diagnostic on the data. So focusing on that key. And then this is just to show a little bit about what's happening around us. So more trials with more patients with more data. And the veracity of the data is exploding. So we are starting to do trials that include continuous glucose monitoring, which is streaming data that compared to the old days where it was basically you had a questionnaire and what's your blood pressure today, and sometimes we measure 3 times on the scale. Now we are getting real-time streaming data in with 8 samples per second. So that's a lot of data. And that's where you start to then have to process that in a completely different way. And where also the regulators recognize that if we don't approach that in a different way, we'll basically lose the needle in the haystack. So the classical methods of data cleaning and so forth are out the window. And that's what we need to make sure that our data infrastructure can work on. So clinical testing here, making sure that what the labs bring to us can be brought to the patients in a safe way. Yeah. And then now this is the rabbit hole. I thought it was a good shot. So please start following me down this rabbit hole because it sort of, the regulation around what we do, and this was sort of happy developers in a regulated environment. The regulation sort of started back in '97, where we got the FDA Modernization Act. And then same year came CFR 21 Part 11. Anybody who works in pharma that has done anything with computers and validation can quote that. Very few people have actually read it end to end. It's very boring and it's very outdated and it stipulates good principles, but principles that were seen in an era, in an epoch of basically, let's write it on a piece of paper with a special pen where the ink can last for 50 years so that I know that I can get back to that record. And that has been a little bit the guiding star for a lot of the stuff that we do has been this, is it as good as a written sort of ink on a piece of paper, and can I trace it the same way? And that goes all the way to how do we want to track audit trail? Basically, we need audit trail on every character enter. Not to know whether they entered the right or wrong thing, but to see, did they change something? And part of that just in reality becomes a little bit difficult and sometimes a little challenging and stalls sort of a little bit of the innovation momentum. This was going on fairly okay with clarifications in 17, and we can sort of be more crisp on what's an electronic signature and what do you mean by predicate rule, and a lot of interesting semantics. And then luckily, and this is just in this context, luckily, it's not that I appreciate COVID, but luckily COVID hit. And then all of a sudden everything locked down. And basically there were trials that were running with patients that were on experimental treatment where you couldn't, there's no option to just stop. Right? That's ultimately, that would potentially result in people dying, even if nobody wants that, right? So we had to find a lot of ways on how can we sort of keep working and remote when the patients can't come to the clinic and we can't go and do the blue in signature. And so FDA came out, and EMA as well, came out with some really good and constructive guidelines around how can we actually go fully electronic, and how can we get to a more modern approach on this? And that momentum is still ongoing. There we are starting to wind a little bit back, but that's part of the momentum that we are also using. Can we work smarter? Can we work in a way where correcting errors and the ability to do that timely is actually more important than avoiding error? We all know that Murphy is on board. We just haven't found him yet. So having the possibility to actually react when Murphy pops up and then correct the error and deploy next day with a fix is quite often more valuable than trying to spend half a year on qualifying a solution and you're still not going to find him because he's going to be poking in with a human error on, oh, I chose that this install script, I was smarter, so I do it this way, and then all falls apart. Question?
The one-sided story. You get the direction from FDA. I guess it's a two-way communication. Are you presenting a vision, or as a Coca-Cola-sized company, let's say?
Yeah.
How this could work in a modern world in the 21st century?
So the question is this a two-way street or is it just dictatorship? I think it is to a large extent a two-way street, but where the regulators have the right to approve your next drug. So when we submit a request for approval of a drug, we would really like them to approve that, because that is a multi-billion investment that has been running for the last 7 years. So you really want to please them. And part of that, the dialogue, and Anne is, who's also in pharma, right, can testament to this. The dialogue is ongoing and it's there, and it's also constructive, but it's clear who has the long end of the stick. And there are stuff where we are bending over backwards in stuff that is a little strange, but we just do it because that's how they like it. So good example, Japanese authorities, we have these CGM measurements, big data. We want to transfer them and we go, but we can put them in this cloud store and then you can pick it up there. And they're like, yeah. And then we go, okay, good. We'll put it on a hard disk and we'll put a guy in a plane and then he'll fly down there. And then they go, but what about if the plane falls out of the sky? And then we go, okay, we'll take 2 hard disks. We'll put 2 guys on 2 separate planes and we'll fly to Tokyo. Does that explain? Yeah. So part of it is a super constructive dialogue, and also a dialogue where the regulators are constantly pushing themselves and being pushed internally as well. So part of the modernization acts that are, some of them are excluded, right? But part of that is also the bureaucracy of the either EMA or FDA or PMDA pushing for how can we work smarter and more modern. And that is, of course, ultimately to drive down cost of treatment. So the more efficient we can be in our testing and creation of clinical drugs, the cheaper products. And we all want the best possible products at the lowest possible cost, right? Was that an okay answer? But it is a two-way street. Yes, Anna? No. So they are also pushing for this. Let's make sure that we do a systematic and machine-driven approach, that we do statistical data cleaning, statistical data review, that we sort of embrace the magnitude of data, and that scrolling through endless lists doesn't yield anything. And a lot of the processes we are doing basically impacts 3% of the data. And so, yeah, it's not radical. Yeah, this was just to give you a little bit of insight into, this is where it started, 97. A lot of the ground principles are still there and are still dominated from paper was so good. Yes. 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 Australia doesn't exist. It's in the big scheme of things, right? There's the Americas, there's EMEA, and there's PMDA. They have a lot of influence because of the magnitude of the market, and because on some of these electronic trends, an interesting bit is actually that FDA, and sorry if I'm digressing, and damn! No, but an interesting bit is that where EMA, the European regulation, they look at more at processes and did you do as you planned, and right? FDA actually, they take an approach which is basically give us your statistical program and give us all of the data. And then we'll run our own analysis and we'll see if we get the same result as you do. So we'll rerun your program, but we'll also make our slices of the data and see, do we get the same conclusion as you did? Leading sometimes to interesting questions of, but the demographics is different in the US, so how does this apply to the US population? And which is a fair question, right? And we're not looking at country cohorts, right? We're looking at ethnicity, and does that make sense? But they are taking up space. And in the electronics, they've been sort of spearheading quite a bit. Sorry. Yes. Good. And that is also a good introduction to some processes that you see how they are mapped in the system landscape. All of these integrations are batch. Every night we move a file. We have upped that a little bit, but that gets us to a situation where George joins, and then he goes, "Ooh, this is scary." And like Moritz, how can we work smarter? Let's not be too dumb. Take it away.
Okay, very good. So after these 30 minutes of slides, you can see, you can imagine that when someone starts in this industry, they got a bit scared of like, do I even want to enter into this, right? Like if I love technology and if I like to develop, then all of this is a huge hindrance for myself and for my passion, right? So like one of the questions is like, is the code that I write going to be regulated? And like, oh yeah, this looks very bureaucratic to me. Like suddenly you have all these things that you need to care about besides doing what you love about. And then of course we have a lot of manual steps that we need to write, that we need to execute in as part of our work, right? So all these questions are challenges for different reasons. And what I want to say is that this is just DevOps. Okay? So what we do in practice in our daily activity is essentially DevOps. So we have our source code in Python. We use our typical libraries, PyTest, Pandas, Pydantic, and many others like SQL Alchemy. So all the things that you are familiar with from an open source world. And we essentially just use them in a context that is regulated. So we just apply a bit more control over how we release the software, especially because some of the releases may have an impact that we need to be aware of. But ultimately is essentially DevOps. And that's what we do in our daily work. Yep. So there are 3 requirements that this industry has ultimately. One of them is that we must describe what the software is doing. And you must describe it in a way that people can understand, and especially for the users, right? So if you're presenting a value on a screen for a doctor and you're telling the doctor, please inject this amount of drug in the participant, he must be well aware of where the value came from and whether he can trust that result and what it means. That it means inject this amount. Does not mean inject 2 times this amount or half time this amount. So it needs to be very clear what is the intended use. The second one is that there is risks that things will fail, and ultimately things will fail. So you need to have a bit of conscious about what are the impact and what is the risk of things to fail. And these things need to be assessed. So I can run a release process and I can just create a release and release it. But I need to be conscious about what is the potential impact and the potential risk if this thing fail and what are the consequences for the persons that are using the software. Okay? The third one is that some of them, not all of them, but some of the releases require approval. So they require ultimately someone that is responsible for the system that we are operating. So it cannot be just a person that goes to the computer, sends it something to a doctor, and then the doctor injects someone incorrectly, and who is responsible? No one. I mean, the person that was there. But wait, but that doesn't work like that, right? So you need a chain of responsibility and a chain of approvals for this. And that's essentially what is the extra steps within the DevOps context. So what I thought it was going to be fun to do here today is we are about to do a release of one of our solutions live for you. Yeah. Just to try to demonstrate to you that is not so difficult, not so different as what we do in releasing open source. For example, an Apache project. Let's see, right? You can see me here right now. So, so let's see if this works. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So let's do this. Oops, this is running so fast, cannot keep up. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I prepared a pull request of one of our solutions that I'm going to merge because it's been already approved. Next, I will create a release note. I don't know if you're familiar with this notion, but it's the idea that in open source we do very often. So essentially, it's a note that describes what the changes, what is the release going to do, what are the main changes, and keeping in mind these three things that I just mentioned to you, let's describe them in the release note because that's something that we need to do, right? As part of these three requirements: impact, risk, and describe intended use. In the case of the intended use, it's already been described, so I don't need to change anything because the intended use of this release doesn't change. So then we create a release note. We create a Git tag. We push it. Very common. I don't know if you use like DevOps, but that's one way to do it, right? You just tag your repository and just push the tag, and that triggers a CI pipeline that then does the release. Yep. And then next final one is we follow the pipeline. So given the time, I will now jump to the computer there because I will have to, at least Git tags, I will need to do it right on the computer.
And this is to production. So we hope the demo gods are actually with us. But we have enough hubris confidence.
Yeah. So this is one of our repositories. It's one of our solutions. This solution essentially brings data from something called an ECOA, which is a platform that has a phone, an iPhone, that the person is using to provide data to Novo Nordisk as part of our of the clinical trial. And this data moves to something called Unix IC. So it's a system that performs the analysis of the clinical trial that is used then for submission. Yeah. Yep, I will try. Yep, good idea. Okay, so most of you, I hope, are familiar with Python. So this is a typical Python project. So you have a source which has about some modules here. You can see. We have some requirements, and you can see here, right? I don't know if you're familiar with them, but this is to interact with Azure. This is to interact with AWS. We are using the cloud, so that's why. Then we have Pydantic, a wonderful package in Python for data validation and data types and data classes. PySFTP, because unfortunately the service that we are providing to still use an SFTP server, and then Lambda multiprocessing, because we can use multiprocessing in Lambda, so we just have this small package. So this is just to give an idea of, this is the dependencies of this solution. So at this point, we can go to the pull request that was created to do this, and this is introducing a new trial. So this trial started 2 days ago. First visit was 2 days ago. It just started, and we are essentially onboarding the trial in the systems that will do the processing of this trial. You can see that's a very small change. We essentially are introducing a new trial to a list, and that's why also we can do it live. I don't think that we can just put anything live here. But essentially, we just introduce a new trial into into a list. It's a very small configuration. This has been approved by both a person, Vicky is a person from Unix SE, so it's the receiving end. And you can see that we do the approvals of the other people in the company through a pull request. And then we have Jonas that is sitting right here, over there. And that is with the computer on, as you can see why. But he has approved the change, so he's what we'd consider like an SME, so he's a software developer that approved the change. At this point, we can just merge it, right? So you can just complete it. We use squash commit because then it the messages become very nicely. And as this is merging, I can now go to the repository and can do git checkout main. Let's just make sure that we are in main. We then do git pull so that we get that change that has just been merged. There you go. These were the only change that we need to do. So next step, we are preparing a release. Next step, we have the change that we want. Now let's do change log, right? So we need to write a release log, just like in open source. So let's do that. Given the time and so on, I will have to essentially present you just put here the change log and prepare it and send it to you. But I will go through it just so that you know what we are doing here. So this is, by the way, this releases and this list here. You're probably very familiar with it, but it's just a mechanism to describe releases in software. You just put it on the Git repository. So what we are doing here is you can see it's Markdown, right? It's not a Word document. It's not some system somewhere. It's just Markdown, right? And what you can see here is I'm describing the change. So this is a backward compatible change to add support for this trial and other minor improvements, because there were already 2 pull requests in main that I completely forgot this morning, and well, we can just release them also. This release has no impact to existing functionality. It's just adding a new trial and has a low risk due to the small scope change and the test strategy that we are using. So we're just describing risk, impact, and what we are about to do. You have the list of new features, list of improvements, which you can generate automatically if you're using something like Git logs and stuff like that. We currently don't have the time to do it, but essentially it's just a list of pull requests, right, that we are doing with a small description of what they do. Good. We have a change log. So we can just do git add, documentation, releases, 1.4. Markdown, git checkout -b, add release, git commit -m, added release note, git push origin, add release. And you can see we have a very consistent branch naming policy. It's just some stuff that I just came up with here. And at that point, I can just create a release note, added release note, and I will put here Jonas and Thomas. Thomas is our QC, so it's the person that is responsible for the development process to be aligned with the processes that Novo Nordisk has. So I don't even need to add a description here, so I'll just put it like that. This will take a bit of time because it runs the CI/CD all the way again. So I will just set it to autocomplete and leave it for Jonas and Thomas to go through it. Jonas already approved because he knew that what was the release note, so that's cheating a bit, but it's okay. So we will just wait for this and for the release note, and I will continue the presentation, and we will come back to this a bit. But what you expect here is this goes into main. I create the Git tag, I push it, it triggers the release pipeline. That's it. And this is our release process.
It might also be important. I think I noticed in there that part of this is also controlling basically the instructions. So associated with this, there's of course, you saw that this was include an extra trial in the pipeline, so get that in and so forth. But then we also have some instructions for use and some extra documentation, and that's embedded in the documentation here. So it's making sure that you actually, as part of your control system for the code and the code stack, that you also have the instructions for use and so forth, that's merged in. Because then it becomes a complete package. What do you do and how do you do it?
Yeah, I will give a short intro to that, but let's just go through. So main statement here is that software development is a process. I can now go back to there. So it has a set of steps: coding, CI, PR review. Some of them made by humans, like what I just did. Some of them made by a computer, CI/CD. But it has a set of outcomes and a set of risks. And what we have to think about is that this is a process, just like any other process. So we just have to interpret it as such when we are thinking about a team of people working towards something, right? Yep. Yeah. Yes, we essentially describe it in a developer handbook of what, given a size of change, how you should approach it, and whether, for example, we involve other people from outside of the team. But what we are pushing heavily is that even people from outside of our team conduct the technical review, the SME review, in the pull request. And then we have a very technical decision or technical discussion about the change, which involves not only the team that we are in, but also the stakeholders that are impacted or potentially impacted by this.
But, and part of the journey, and that has been prerequisite, has been to bring the QA along.
Yeah.
So part of this is also bringing our QA along in a sort of confidence building on where you are included in the process, and it's not that we come and spring something to you 3 o'clock at night. And so there's been quite a bit of onboarding over a couple of years, and we have some QAs now that actually trust the process and have also seen the benefits of exactly this. And when error then happen, then we can actually correct it by tomorrow, which is sometimes more important. Does that? So I think it's a journey.
I will need to skip the questions, and I will continue afterwards. I will actually just skip this slide, and since we don't have the time, it's fine. One of the things I want to mention here is that in terms of requirements, so what do we need from a software development process? And what we need is essentially fit for intended use. So the goal of the process is to produce software that is fit for intended use. So it solves the problem, and that is very different from open source. In open source, you have a license, right? MIT, BSD, Apache, and the license explicitly states there is no fitness for purpose, and I'm not liable for anything that you use this for. Here is the complete opposite. We have a specific fitness for purpose, which is whatever the end user is expecting the software to do, right? And that's why we very much use open source, and we even with those licenses, because then we are the ones that are responsible for that fitness and have the controls to produce that fitness for use, right? Then we have a couple of other requirements, high quality, high throughput, right? We need to be fast. And a big one is, of course, great developer experience, and that's why I'm presenting you here. You can see that these are not Word documents, these are not other stuff. Is everything in Markdown, in the repository, and we can do that as long as we have involvement of the stakeholders in how to do that, and we document, of course, how this is done. Easy to inspect by authorities. This is a requirement. The important thing here is that we cannot just write the code and have the solution available to our colleagues. We must be able to open the books and show to an inspector, this is what this code is doing, this is how we developed it, this is how we control it. Can we do it for the end? Because otherwise I don't have the time. And then finally, easy to maintain in terms of low runaway costs. In terms of risks, the main risks of we see in this process is repetition fatigue and human error. And that's because we are developers. We want to automate everything we can. And every time someone does not automate something and we have to do it twice, there is a very high risk that I will either just press or I will copy paste and press, right? Because like, I'm doing this again, why? It's the same thing. I should have automatized this process and I get over it. Second one is that documentation can become outdated. I know that development is not about documentation. It's very common. No one wants to assume this, but it's extremely common that what you write in the documents for authorities is not what the software is doing. It drifted months ago. So what we aim to do here is that because the persons that write the documents need to be developers, because they are the ones that know the software and what are the risks of the software and what the software is doing, they are the ones that need to control that. But for that to happen, we need to make that writing and that maintainability in the development world, not in some Word documents or whatnot. So Markdown in the repository, which is where we like to work. And finally, loss of talented developers. They are very much related. I mean, if we cannot find a set of tooling and processes that are good for a developer in today's world, then we will lose them. And we will lose them for companies that don't need these requirements. And when we lose them, we lose quality of the software, we lose quality of the process, and a bunch of other stuff. So that is important, and that's crucial in this process. And that's these risks, and together with these requirements, is what we have been driving towards having a process that is much more towards developer-oriented than QC-oriented. Okay, and many of you probably don't understand how how the industry is in respect to documentation and so on. But this is, I've seen this in large companies. I've seen this in Palo Alto in small companies. It's always the same. QC imposes processes that are completely outdated and do not fit how a developer works today. And there are nothing that benefits from that process. Although QC, we benefit a lot from what they have to say about the process and the risks. And that's why we are trying to merge these two things, on which developers keep the process of how we build software and how we document and so on. QC is working to controlling that process in the sense of supervising and telling us, okay, so have you considered this risk for this set of users or something like that? So that's more or less what I have to say. I will skip all of this stuff. Just to say, I will just demo the final part that I wanted to show you, which is essentially the repository. This is what we care about in our repositories. And I want to show you exactly how this is. Is this been done? No, it's still running. That's okay. In this repository, what you see here is the following. So we have an Azure pipeline. This is essentially the CI/CD that we describe how we are testing, verifying, and releasing to production. So you can probably see here some tests, some stage 4 testing, stage 4 publishing, and stage 4 deployment. And in the deploy, we also have a formal test in validation. So we have the CI/CD, we have the tests, right? In this case, both unit and acceptance test. Then we have the source code that we already gave you an introduction, and then we have the documentation, which essentially stuff of, for example, let's go through this risk here, just to give you a quick glimpse of what we care about. So this solution supports an important GCP process in Novo Nordisk. It integrates EPID, a platform for clinical trials, with Novo Nordisk statistical compute environment, which is where Novo Nordisk performs data management and analysis for trial submission. For this reason, this solution has an indirect impact to submission to authorities. So you see, this is what we are releasing today, is this step. And then we essentially describe some of the risks and some of the ways that we mitigate these risks. Okay? And this is required, right? We developers need to build this stuff. No one else can tell us about this stuff. But we just put it on Markdown so that it makes it easier for people to think about it and to just write it. Yeah. And then finally, so we have documentation, source, tests, then we have CI, and then, of course, we have our AWS CloudFormation templates, which is how we deploy infrastructure. In this case, we control infrastructure, something called infrastructure as code, which essentially guarantees some time of idempotency of our deployments, of our CI/CDs, for example. Yeah. So this is it. Let's see if I can close this one. Yeah, the release note has been done. So now at this point, I can just come here, right? I should go to git checkout main, git pull. Yes, git tag 1.4.0, git push origin 1.4.0. And that's it. At this point, if we go to our CI/CD pipeline, come here, and this will start the whole process of releasing. And so you can see here that is the published part, but this is the main thing here. We essentially verify that the documentation is correct. We have some tests for documentation. Then we summarize the development in a small JSON file. Then we deploy to Val. We verify automatically in Val that the things are working as intended. So it's essentially a staging environment for those familiar with another term. And then we have 2 approvals before production. As I mentioned, most releases require approval. So we have some people we need to press a button and verify a bunch of stuff. And then it deploys to prod. You can see that there is one step there, deploy to prod. So I will just leave this screen here, and while we have a chat, you can follow this thing being deployed to production.
And we persuaded Thomas to work late to approve it, or
we can also, Jonas can also approve his infrastructure manager. So we can do that. Yeah, and that's it. That was it. I think you can stop from here.
Annie, you had a question.
Yes, many questions.
many questions.
No. Yep, go ahead.
How many of the artifacts of the past do you have to keep? Things like there's no document to sign clearly, so do you need digital signatures, for instance, to prove identity, or?
Yeah.
Or are you completely moved to a tech company's bureaucracy for ensuring quality, and you just took the quality people on board to say this is actually good enough because the regulator will accept that these processes from tech companies actually are fit for the purpose of ensuring quality in a digital space?
Yeah, there are different parts of the answer, right? So, so I think one part is regarding the electronic signatures. The electronic signature is this part 11 that Henrik was mentioning. This is only required for a small subset of documents, and the critical ones are real submissions. When you pick the documentation that you're about to submit to authorities. Right? This is not on the IT space. In the IT space, we have 1 or 2 documents that require electronic signatures, but those are large-scale documents like the general overview of a system.
High level, anybody who has authority here is under a set of initials where in our people in organization, we know who's who.
Yeah. In this case,
and we retain that, right? So part of that is retaining the long trace of who actually signed this 20 years ago.
You have audit logs, they're inspectable by
Yes, yes. And part of that is that we have training logs for staff and that they're qualified. And so that whole wrapping is still around there. And then we have a few signatures that actually require that you still have a signature sheet where you stipulate my electronic signature is equivalent to but that's only when you sign for really important stuff. Yep.
Are you allowed to use things like GitHub Copilot?
for what?
For development, I mean.
Yeah.
But yes, we are using GitHub Copilot.
And we just use a one that is not does not push data to the public internet. So it's a local deployment
within our tenant.
Yeah.
I think here.
So these identities, are they tied to like signed commits so that you can prove that the audit trail is there, so to say?
Yeah, very good question. So the commits are, of course, anyone can write whatever they want in the commit messages and in the commit author and email. But when we merge, I don't know if you noticed, but we merge with the squash commit, and the button of the pressing of that button must be done by someone that is authenticated on Active Directory, right? And that we can trace back to the individual person. So we are not really care about that the commits are done by a person, because what matters for us is the moment that commit lands in main, what happened. And ultimately, the Git squash will actually remove like a lot of information about the history, and sometimes like it even rewrites the commit message and so on, because ultimately we don't care about that. We care if we don't have a computer here, but if we go to the list of Git commits in main, those ones have been always approved as part of this release as part of this PR review process, and that's sufficient because we are able to track it all the way down to a person that signed something when they enrolled in the company.
And then part of the assumption here, or the prerequisite is, we're working with skilled people. So there's also part of the whole framework that relies on when Jorge does code review, it's because he knows what he's doing. So there's part of the framework of making sure, I mean, sometimes we're walking around with a loaded pistol and you can do something bad. Let's make sure we don't do that, but we have skilled people. There was a question in the back.
Yeah. I think I don't need it. So yeah, the procedure is pretty much standard. So the only difference is that you are actually doing it well, very well, and by the book, right? And so the question is, how do you enforce this? How do you make sure that the organization is actually following these practices? And is it down to individual teams' responsibility to do that?
We are in full control of this team.
In your case, but how do you make sure?
No, but so we're not. This is not something that is exported to everybody, and it requires skill and grit. And if you don't, if you want the other process, you can have that. But it's just we're just showcasing that we can do this way, which actually results in better quality, in higher throughput on code, that errors are discovered because they're pushed to production so that we can actually discover them, and then we can correct them while the code is fresh in the developer's head, instead of something that happened 6 months ago. So there's parts of that that just intrinsically builds more quality.
Yeah, but at the same time, you're also legally liable for the things.
Yes.
So who owns the responsibility for that?
in this part, in this project, right? So there is a whole organization quality in Novo Nordisk that has a set of SOPs and follows through some ISO standards. But then we essentially are using part of those SOPs to fulfill those obligations under Henrik.
So for a number of these activities, I'm the platform owner. And so it's me being barbecued if something goes wrong. No, yeah. I think so. First of all, we need to be super, super crisp on when we call the GXP card. I think it's much more interesting to be crisp on what part of GXP and when are we talking about qualified solutions and when are we talking about GXP impact. And I think that the maturity generally in the industry is not very high there. There's a lot of people throwing around three-letter acronyms without really understanding what they talk about. A lot of this.
Speaking of three-letter acronyms, can you
So there's a concept that we work with on the rec called GXP, which is good X practice. And that can be manufacturing, that can be lab, that can be clinical, that can be, so good practice, which is demonstrated and documented. And it is back to, if you didn't document it, it didn't happen. But there's on manufacturing, there's very, very rigid requirements because basically if we make a blunder, thousands, if not millions, can die. So you really, really don't want to sort of be agile there. A lot of the stuff that we do, we're crisp, and that's back to the risk assessment. We're very crisp on when can people actually die. And when can we just do something that maybe compromises a little bit on data integrity and then be crisp on how do I find that? So what is the mitigation where I can actually truly see, is this integrity broken or not? Does that? So I think in the GXP context, it's you really, really work on figuring out what's the implication, what's the scope, what happens if it goes wrong, be crisp on your risk assessment, and then work from that in a qualified dialogue with your quality organization on what is it that we're working with here. Does that help answer? Yes, 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 yeah. We bucket them, so at a corporate level, we bucket them in two, but then we'll granulate that at the lower level. Because within GXP, non-GXP, we can have a qualifying dialogue around what is then the risk on this GXP process, right?
So in this case here, you can see that we classify this as GXP because the data shared by the solution is used for trial submissions. But then, for example, it does not have any impact to patient safety, and we don't classify that as an impact to product quality. Okay, it has an impact on healthcare regulated activity.
And this is part of the beauty of having the developers and the QAs all the way in the journey. Because the QA actually sometimes comes with scenarios where I'm like, but that would never happen, but then it happens, right? And then you really, really like to catch that. It does that. So their contribution to the process is incredibly valuable, but it's also really valuable to have the developers that can actually understand what is the code that I'm writing and what are the mitigations that I can actually do. Fun fact, I was part of developing an app where we did all the tests and all the trimmings and still ended up that if you used an outdated browser, you would get a recommendation on a dose that would kill you. And we had done all the right stuff, everything except considered that people would find a Yahoo browser from, yeah, what can you do, right? But that's where it's nice to have experienced QA on board that actually comes with, but have you thought about if there's a Yahoo browser out there, right? But then link that up with skilled developers that can actually think about how can what can I do of technical mitigations and not have that in a Word requirement doc, but something much more lived. Yeah, we are over time, Anders, right? Are people still alive, or is it okay? If people have to leave, it's fine. We won't take offense. Other questions? Yep.
So what does the process look like when something goes wrong? Let's say you have like a application, medical application, digital medicine product, and then something happens. People are not dying, but you need to prove, for example, to the FDA that your system was working correctly. How is that done, and how much responsibility within the company lies with the technical team? Because I can imagine that a lot of the expertise is medical expertise, which the developers not have, and probably you don't have. So you need to work with.
I mean, yeah. So in incidents like that, you make a war room, and you get the right people in there, and there is a clear rally around. Let's make sure to correct the problem. And there's no culture of your fault or my fault or whose fault. Right? I think that, and I've been part of a few, not many, and it was super nice to experience that there is no sort of internal, no, it's super much, I mean, this stuff like that should never happen. And everybody realizes that. And there's no sort of finger pointing, or it's then you just rally together, you figure out what can you do. And it's the classic sort of stop the accident, mitigate root cause, why, right? With the purpose of identifying what can we do and how can we avoid this going forward, right? And but of course, focus initially is on stop, right? But Murphy is, I mean, it back to who thinks about people can find a Yahoo browser. And then you sit there and you've written all the requirements, and it must be a modern browser, yeah, right? But and you ultimately, it's also a learning of what's the ultimate safeguard. So when it's always nice to have this in the back of your head when you're designing or defining. If things go really wrong, how can we make sure that it doesn't go really, really wrong? In this case, we have now guardrails on, you can never recommend anything more than this, right? Then you would say, go and talk to your doctor. This is strange, right? We can't, you are outside of the math, which sometimes happens, and life is complicated, and we're strange beings.
I think we take one more question. Otherwise, we are still hanging around.
So my initial question had two parts. The one that I was very interested in working for Pharma previously was, how did you approach the QA colleagues to be on this journey, to change paradigm, let's say, from kind of work in a DevOps way, let's say?
So you start by finding one good friend. And then you groom and train. And then you get 2, and then you get 3, and then you get 5. And it's still small cohorts of believers, right? But it's actually starting to really get some traction. And also this,
it's bottom up.
It's very much bottom up. No, it's complete bottom up. And part of it is very much spurred by our cloud journey, and we can do better. Let's do better, right? And then how can we get QA in, and how can we, and then a combination of some skilled people that actually want to do it right, and not just do it, and then some experience and not to bloat me, but stepping in and taking some risk that doesn't always give a bonus, but actually moves things forward, right? And I think that has helped. And then we are getting we are doing amazing stuff that people also notice, and that then all of a sudden Vicky smiling. I'm like, yeah, it's a colleague. We are doing some great stuff, which is really nice. And then also back to the GXP, try to sort of be crisp on what is the risk profile, because sometimes the risks are really high, and sometimes they're manageable, and sometimes it's just data integrity, and we can all, if we lean in, we can all sort of, that we can manage, that we can control, that we can test and verify, right? We can't test and verify whether someone is actually 92 centimeters tall, and that's reality. And
so another aspect I at least when communicating with QC, so just give context. So I end up reading the whole GAN5 and reading most of the legislation on FDA and EMA, which allow me to have the language to speak. So then the question that becomes more about discussing, having a principle discussion about what are we trying to mitigate, or what is that you want. Then I want a document. No. What does the document represent? What is the thing that we are trying to get from a document? And exactly. And then you just continue doing that. And of course, if you add the language and some of the background of what are the main principles behind this topic, this discipline, then it's first you demonstrate that you can have a technical discussion with that person without disregarding what the person is saying, because there is a lot of important concepts and information on this topic. It's not just like they do know how to run a process and how to approach a process. And in software development, we have a lot of blind sides that we completely ignore, and we need someone to be guiding us through that process. Like one of them, the most common one, is this notion that what's the name? The pride and this interaction within teams, that sometimes it's about who is the best at coding and these type of things that lead to an atmosphere that's not always the best for quality. That is part of a risk. It is a risk. And you need to go through that journey of understanding how QC thinks about it, to understand that, yes, that we need to think about very deeply into the process that we are running in order to be able to approach them from what they are looking at. I think that's...
Yeah, and then super lucky to have also QA people that are engaged. And I mean, we had one night where it was QA kept on till 4 o'clock at night.
That's my experience. Either sitting in a room Friday night up to, until we
and we
but coding, but
they
it was
stopped
coding.
at 4, we stopped at 5. That's where you really, and that brings out this also the team spirit of let's rally around this, and we're in this together, right? And I think it is about making sure that you also take them along. So many times have I seen implementation projects where it's you go to QA with basically arm around the neck and then please sign, right? And they have no clue on what's going on, and that's not fair. I hope this has been interesting.
I think that was a very good note to end on.
Thank you, George.
Thank you very much to both of you for a very interesting talk. I was hoping we would finish deploying, but apparently it was.
I think now it's just approvals. So I think Jonas, you're up.
Oh. If you do have more questions or want to keep discussing, then we are going to meet back up where the drinks are. We get kicked out at 10.
Yep.
So please finish pizza. There's lots left. See you up there.
And this is what we need, someone to help architects just on steroids. So if you have friends or you are interested, reach out.